Early explorers like Martin Pring and Captain John Smith discovered what became the Maine seacoast and claimed it for king and country, completely ignoring the indigenous population. King James I granted to 40 noblemen, knights, and gentlemen a charter known as the Council of Plymouth. In 1622, the council granted to Sir Ferdinando Gorges and Captain John Mason all the lands between the Merrimack and Kennebec rivers, reaching 60 miles inland, with all the islands within 5 leagues of the shore. This tract was called the Province of Maine. In 1629, land was split, giving to Mason what is now New Hampshire. Then there was a race for settlements between the Plymouth group at Odiorn Point, led by David Thompson, and the Hiltons further upriver, Mason and Gorges on the Kittery side of the river. Over time came men named Shapley, Champernoun, Frost, Cutts, Bray, and a fisherman named William Pepperell. A community was growing, more people arrived. Colonization was taking hold, more land was needed and taken. Native uprisings and violence increased, garrisons were built. A fort was needed. Pepperell by then had attained wealth and land. He donated some of that land, and a fort of sorts was established. It was named Fort Pepperell.
You may know Fort McClary as a popular spot for everything from military battle reenactments put on by the Friends of Fort McClary, to weddings, from group picnics and family reunions, to solitary dreamers gazing out at the beauty of the Piscataqua River and beyond. Even though the fort has been around for over 375 years, many people may not know some amazing and yes, even surprising facts about its rich history. Let's go inside.
Did you know that not a single battle ever took place here? Even though at times there were some 200 people stationed on these grounds. But not a single shot was fired in anger. But that doesn't make Fort McClary any less fascinating or historically significant. So let's share and explore some interesting and maybe even unexpected facts. First of all, the name. The fort was named for Major Andrew McClary, a native of New Hampshire. McClary was the highest ranking officer and the last American soldier to be killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. But here's the interesting story of New Hampshire's Major McClary.
I was an innkeeper and landowner in Epsom, New Hampshire, not far from Concord. I was described as a soldier noted for his bravery, good looks, and popularity. When I heard of the news of Lexington and Concord, I left my wife and 7 children and in 24 hours marched to Medford, Massachusetts, where I was elected as a major in Stark's company.
Now here's where his story gets interesting. To quote author D. Hamilton Hurd,
having passed the last place of danger, he went back to see if the British were disposed to follow them across the neck, thus exposing himself to danger anew. His men cautioned against his rashness. "The ball is not yet cast that will kill me," said he. Then a random shot from a frigate struck a buttonwood tree, and glancing passed through his abdomen. Throwing his hands above his head, he leaped several feet from the ground and fell forward upon his face, dead. A longtime friend, Henry Dearborn, had his body carried to Medford, where he was interred with all the respect and honors we could exhibit to a great and good man.
In 1836, laborers were digging on Winter Hill and unearthed what was believed to be the remains of his coffin and bones. Later, William Henry Montague, the last surviving founder of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, secured some of the bones and the coffin handles and preserved them among his relics. But the history of the fort goes back much further in time. There is mention that a fort of sorts was on that property as early as 1623, but there's no hard evidence of that. The site occupied by Fort McClary has been an important military defensive position since 1689, when William Pepperell, a wealthy merchant and landowner, acquired a tract of land later known as Battery Pasture, which was adjacent to his own home. The first structures were simple earthworks and a small blockhouse and were collectively known as Pepperell's Garrison or Fort Pepperell. Pepperell's garrison was one of 10 in the lower part of Kittery in 1690. It was not until 1715 that the colony of Massachusetts Bay, which included Maine, voted to erect a permanent fortification of 6 guns for the defense of the Piscataqua River. This was called a paper fort because the actual construction of the fort began around 1720. The position of a naval officer was also established to collect duties from every ship entering the harbor and to prevent New Hampshire's naval officer from extracting unreasonable fees. This money was used to purchase ammunition for the fort, now named Fort William after William Pepperell. Many historians, and even a sign affixed to a tree back in the day, claim the fort was named in honor of Sir William Pepperell. But that is unlikely since he was only 19 at the time and 20 years away from the siege of Louisbourg that made him an international superstar and a baronet. In all likelihood, the fort was named to honor his father, Colonel William Pepperell. Was generating revenue a driving force behind the construction of Fort McClary? Some historians say yes. Or put another way, Fort McClary was intended to protect Maine, then part of Massachusetts, from unreasonable duties or taxes. Taxes that the governor of New Hampshire was attempting to impose on nearby citizens of other colonies. The fort was also used to collect duties from Massachusetts citizens for their own upkeep. Those piers and wharf were located next door at what was then called Warehouse Row. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, the Pepperell family remained loyal to the British Crown. The second Sir William Pepperell, he was the son of Sir William's daughter Elizabeth and Nathaniel Sparhawk, nephew and heir to much of the family fortune, grabbed what he could and fled the country through Canada to England. Sadly, his wife died while on the journey. Her body is buried in Halifax. Sir William, too, was treated very well in England. After all, his namesake was a national hero. Back in Kittery Point, local citizens confiscated all the Pepperell property belonging to the family, including the fort, through the Confiscation Act. Lady Pepperell sat out the war in Boston. She returned to her home in Kittery Point after the war, having to repurchase the property as it too was confiscated. By the way, she lived her remaining years in quiet comfort near her beloved church. During our research, we were told that she wrote many hymns, but to date no hymns or proof of any kind has been discovered. Oh, one quick question. As everything was taken, where did the money come from for her to live on? Because Sir William was a baronet, even after his death, she received a pension from the King of England. How's that for irony? In 1776, ammunition was provided for the fort's 9-pounder and 12-pounder cannons, and the New Hampshire militia manned the fort until 1779. It was then abandoned, but the fort was too strategically located to stay unused and neglected for long. It is possible that one reason it never saw a battle was that its location, with Fort Constitution on the New Hampshire side of the river, and a treacherous river current, ship's captains knew their chances of success were minimal at best. A British officer once told of going up the Piscataqua, disguised as a fisherman, to find out the feasibility of an attack on the Navy Yard. On his returning to the fleet and reporting that the town was swarming with soldiers and well defended, the British commander abandoned the project. The fort was officially established by Massachusetts in 1715. It was in 1808 that Massachusetts ceded 1 acre and 139 rods, or 1.87 acres, containing the fort to the United States government, but with concurrent jurisdiction with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It was active throughout the 19th century, most notably during the War of 1812 and the American Civil War. For a time between 1812 and 1861, the keeper of the fort was Colonel George Sparhawk. He was a native of Portsmouth and a descendant of a brother of Nathaniel Sparhawk. However, the money, the properties, the ships, all the Pepperell wealth was gone when George was a boy. But George's father inherited the Atkinson fortune from Portsmouth, and it was a major inheritance. George's family, like Nathaniel Sparhawk and his family, lived wildly beyond their means, and without income to replace it, the money was soon all but gone. No matter that, George throughout his life carried himself with an heir to the manor born. His obituary reads like this:
"A man of transparent honesty, undoubted integrity, and delicate modesty, in the world of show he never made a great figure. And in his declining days and declining fortunes he made less and less. But in the social circle, as a friendly and intelligent companion, and in the domestic as a brother, husband, and father, he had a character which shone brighter and brighter."
Though he failed in business many times, he rose to the rank of colonel of the 1st Regiment of the New Hampshire Militia. But ill health prevented him from advancing his military career. He secured the appointment of the keeper of Fort McClary, and there he brought his wife and 3 daughters. Sadly, his wife and 1 daughter died while residing at the fort. Eventually, he lost his appointment as keeper due to politics. No matter, he still wore his great military cloak and carried himself as an officer, though he was reduced to being a clerk at the Navy Yard. He also kept the books for his friend Robert Follett Garish at his Kittery Point warehouse, and he briefly taught school at the old Pepperell Mansion. How times had changed. With the Civil War looming on the horizon, Fort McClary once more was activated. When the Confederate raider Alabama was reported as seen off Portland, Portsmouth stood at the ready. At Kittery Point, the Honorable Charles Bellamy of Pepperell Mansion organized the defense along the waterfront. He requested from the commander of the Navy Yard military supplies. He received cannon, carriages, and ammunition, as well as the use of the Navy Yard's chief gunner and his assistant. Then Bellamy asked his friend Robert Follett Garish to arrange transportation of the guns to the fort. 50 yoke of oxen were brought in voluntarily by the country farmers to move 4 of the cannon and carriages. Thought to be too heavy for the Kittery Point Bridge, the guns were hauled around Spruce Creek through Kittery Point Village and entered the fort close to the point where tourists enter today. The cannon were mounted, scaled, and fired, but the fort never challenged. Shortly thereafter, the government took over command. During the fort's heyday, primarily throughout the 19th century, it was used as a defensive fortification by the United States military to protect approaches to the nearby Piscataqua River at the southern gateway to Kittery, Maine. Rolling back to the 1840s, the fort was further expanded, probably as a result of tensions with Great Britain over the disputed territory between Maine and New Brunswick, which culminated in the bloodless Aroostook War and the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty. In 1846, an additional 25 acres were purchased, the land where the picnic area is today. The iconic blockhouse you still see today was built in 1844 near the former Upper Battery. And here's a significant fact. This was the last blockhouse built at a fort in Maine, and probably one of the last in the United States coastal forts. Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, visited Fort McClary when he was Secretary of War and declared that it was the best located fort on the Atlantic coast for defense. This brings us to the Civil War. This was an active, bustling time at the fort, and many of the present-day structures you see here today date from this period. The fort was once again garrisoned. The blockhouse was rebuilt. In addition, a barracks, a cookhouse with a mess hall, a chapel, a hospital, a guardhouse, and a magazine, all made of brick, were constructed. A substantial pier was also built. Derricks were installed to lift granite blocks from incoming ships, and a rail system to move the stones from the harbor area was constructed. This began in 1863 as part of the third system of fortifications. The goal was to create a large, 5-sided fort, much like Fort Knox, with 1 or 2 tiers of cannons all around. However, only the seawalls were completed on the 2 seaward fronts. along with one of the landward cannon bastions with a granite magazine. It was manned by the Kittery Artillery Company, and in 1864 was also manned by the Maine State Guard. Did you know that during the Civil War, the fort had a special resident? The Vice President of the United States, Hannibal Hamlin, who enlisted in 1861 in the Maine Coast Guard's Company A. Yes, the Vice President of the United States. He served as a cook here at the fort. For most of his political career, Maine resident Hannibal Hamlin seemed to be at the right place at the right time. He was a Democrat and served as Speaker of the House in Maine. In 1843, he was elected to the House of Representatives. In 1848, he was elected to the Senate after the unexpected death of Senator John Fairfield from malpractice from an incompetent physician. He was an anti-slaver who vigorously opposed the expansion of slavery into the West. When the subject came up in Congress, he said,
"I have no doubt that the whole North will come to the position I have taken. Some damn rascal who may be desirous of disposing of myself will mutter a growl about abolitionism, but I do not care the snap of my fingers for them all."
So how did this liberal, teetotaling Democrat become a Republican and Abraham Lincoln's running mate? Basically, it was blackmail. The newly formed Republican Party threatened that if he did not join their ranks, they would make sure that he did not win re-election to the Senate. So he switched parties. The rest of the deal was that he had to run for governor, which he agreed to do, but only if the legislature would send him back to the Senate as soon as possible. He won handily and served as governor for all of 6 weeks when he was reassigned to begin his third term as senator. In Washington, he provided the Republicans with a strong voice against the policies of James Buchanan's administration. Which brings us to Lincoln. The nomination for vice president came down to Hamlin and William Seward. Hamlin won on the second vote. All of this came as a shock to him. While playing cards in his Washington hotel room, Hamlin heard a racket at the corridor. The door burst open and the room filled with excited men, led by Indiana Congressman Schuyler Colfax, who read a telegram from the convention and addressed him as Mr. Vice President. Stunned, Hamlin said he did not want the office, but was warned that to decline would only give ammunition to the Democrats, suggesting that he was afraid to run on a losing ticket. Hamlin agreed, saying,
"I neither expected it or desired it, but it has been made, and as a faithful man to the cause, it leaves me no alternative but to accept it. At least the duties of this office will not be hard or unpleasant."
Hamlin hated being vice president, describing his job as a fifth wheel on a coach, calling his office a nullity in Washington. He'd gone from being a man of influence to having no influence over anything, although it is said that he had a lot of influence on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which frankly was a big deal. When re-election came around in 1864, he was not on the ticket, so as a lame-duck vice president, when his militia was called to serve at Fort McClary, he had a decision to make: remaining in hot as Hades steamy Washington, D.C., or serve on his beloved Maine coast. So Fort McClary it was, but while he was a humble cook, a lowly private, he did not live in the barracks with the militia. He had a house nearby on what is now Lawrence Lane during his 3-month tour. Finally, on March 4th, 1869, Hamlin happily resumed his old seat at the Senate and pronounced himself cured. There's a lot more available on Hannibal Hamlin. Read about Andrew Johnson's drunken acceptance speech as Hamlin's successor. Now let's get back to the fort itself. In 1870, the fort was described this way.
Officers' quarters, none. Men's quarters, a 1-story brick building containing 2 rooms. It's very old and out of repair, occupied as an ordnance storeroom. Kitchen, with mess room attached, is a 1-story wooden building. It's entirely out of repair. Chapel is a 1-story brick building, inhabitable. A blockhouse is a 2-story hexagonal building, built of granite and wood. It is occupied as an ordnance storeroom. It's in fair repair. The kitchen, built in 1863 by the troops at the post, is poorly constructed, unfinished above the ceiling, and needs repairs. The guardhouse is a 1-story brick building, the roof partly destroyed. the ceiling all down, unoccupied.
The seawall was defended by a small caponnier with rifle ports. Based on war experience and military tactics of the time, masonry forts were thought to be too vulnerable, and funding was withdrawn from all masonry fort projects in 1867, leaving Fort McClary with just a few cannon positions. How many children and adults have climbed on the massive granite blocks that remain at the fort to this day? Here's where the stonecutters worked at their craft. You can see an edge here, and even wedges still embedded in the block. Where are the granite blocks from? How did they get here, and how were they lifted?
Derricks are, back in the day, they would typically consist of a vertical mast. So you'd have something that looked like a mast off a sailing ship that would be embedded in the ground, and it would run up, and there would be actually a boom coming off that. So an angled boom that you could raise and lower to move blocks in and out, and that had blocks and tackle on it. So there was one that hung off the end of the boom for lifting the block off the ground, and then there was another block and tackle that went from the top of the boom to the top of the mast. And so that you could raise up the mast and reduce the radius of where your block was relative to the mast. One of the points with those masts is to resist overturning, you had to have lots of cables, guy wires on it to keep it from falling over. So as we see here, there's a ring in the ground. That may have been one of the anchor points for these guy wires that came off the top of the mast. And those were pretty critical to the function of the derrick. Without those, the derrick would fall over and couldn't lift very much. And we can see from looking around here at the different blocks, there's some really big blocks, multi-ton blocks here. So they must have had a very substantial set of derricks here to move these around and install them on the fort.
I look at these are huge. That one is massive.
Yes.
How big would these derricks have been?
I'm guessing the mast part probably would have been at least 18 inches in diameter. The boom may have been similar to that, because that's probably at least a 20-ton block. Those are big. Even for a contractor these days to move those over the road, you'd be moving one block like that on a semi-flatbed. So they're big blocks. And then installing them onto the fort itself, these have been more dressed, so you lose some of the weight by dressing them down and shaping them to fit. But they had probably had derricks all along here to lift those all into place. They didn't have hydraulic excavators back in the day.
Fast forward to the 1910s. Most of the fort had fallen into disrepair and was officially decommissioned in 1918. The state of Maine acquired most of the property from the United States government in 1924, and Fort McClary became a public park. Interestingly enough, it wasn't until 1961 that the original 1.87 acres containing Fort McClary was transferred to the state of Maine, and it took an act of Congress to make it happen.
Sadly, many of the fort's dilapidated buildings were demolished in the decades that followed. But aren't we lucky for what survived? During World War II, surviving parts of the fort were used by civilian defense forces. In 1969, Fort McClary was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The surviving blockhouse and other structures were renovated in 1987. Although many structures no longer exist, the buildings that you do see here today represent several different periods of construction. Each remaining structure tells a fascinating story of how the fort evolved over time, with upgrades and modifications that reflected the best strategies and military advances of the day to meet our area's defensive needs. Let's take a closer look at some of these innovations and special features, because perhaps even more than the buildings, Fort McClary stands today as one of the state's most important historic forts that dramatically preserves the evidence of military history and changes in wartime architecture and technology. Let's start with the blockhouse. The granite wall, located directly in front of the blockhouse, was part of the site's fortification from 1808 to 1844. Fort McClary's hexagonal blockhouse is today recognized as a uniquely designed military structure. Beginning in 1844, the blockhouse took 2 years to build and was constructed in 3 different layers from materials found in the surrounding area. Its foundation is built of mortared fieldstone. The first-story walls are made of cut granite, and the second story is built of squared logs. The hexagonal blockhouse here at Fort McClary was the last one of its kind constructed in Maine. During World War I, its top level served as an observation and lookout post. It is a truly unique and special survivor.
The main business of the fort was, of course, the defense of shoreline against enemy ships. And this meant cannons and fortifications. So let's move on to munitions. Over the course of 4 years, from 1864 to 1868, the granite walls surrounding the fort were put together as part of a plan to modify the grounds into a large enclosed structure with 2 tiers of cannons. Today, evidence is everywhere serving as a reminder of work never completed. Near the end of the Civil War, advancements in weapon technology made this construction obsolete. There are 5 other structures on the grounds that were either in the original plans or were built later as modifications to the fort. The magazine building, used to store the soldiers' gunpowder, was built around 1808 and is thought to be the oldest structure on the site today. Barracks used to stand on the fort grounds beside the magazine building. It was constructed in 1808 and stood until the 1900s. The barracks provided sleeping quarters for the soldiers stationed here. The caponnier and bastion, both unfinished, are in front of and in back of the fort. Another addition between the years 1864 and 1868 was the granite powder magazine, which was designed to hold the powder for the cannons. In the 1870s, the lower battery was rebuilt with 3 temporary gun positions for 10-inch Parrott rifles, but funding was again cut off and improvements languished. In the 1890s, 9 15-inch Rodmans, the largest muzzle-loading smoothbore cannon ever produced, and 7 carriages were stored at the fort to be mounted in case of war. In fact, 3 of the Rodmans were mounted as an emergency measure in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But newly constructed forts located nearby were gaining attention and a larger role in the defense of our area, including Fort Foster and the new batteries at Fort Constitution under the Endicott program of 1901. In short, Fort McClary's time had passed. Today, visitors are welcome to wander about the various structures. A walking trail provides a bird's eye view of the magazine and a chance to stroll along the tidal waters of Barters Creek. Reenactors periodically set up camps and demonstrate what life was like back in the day, sometimes even showing how skirmishes were fought with muskets and sometimes even cannons. There are some little-known facts and perhaps myths about Fort McClary that may or may not be entirely accurate. It depends on who you ask. One fact we do know is one of the Parrott rifles from Fort McClary, documented and confirmed, is located on a green in a park in Ypsilanti, Michigan.
Here's another fact. Red hot shot was used by coastal forts against wooden ships. Fort McClary's hot shot furnace was right here. The furnaces worked like this. Cold cannonballs were placed on the shot rails or a shot over the firebox and set over the extreme heat until red hot. 3 men were required to manage a furnace. A special tool called a hot shot ladle was used to carry the shot, and they varied in size based on the shot. In loading the shot into the cannon, gun crews placed wads of clay or wet hay between the cannon's gunpowder and the red-hot cannonball to prevent a premature and disastrous explosion. To counter this, shipbuilders adjusted and built ironclads. By the Civil War, hot shot furnaces were pretty much obsolete.
And there are some things about Fort McClary that are open for debate. For example, some fort experts claim this stone corner to be the remains of the original built before 1715. Have you ever noticed these initials carved into a granite block? Whose initials are they? When were they carved? We don't know the answer to either question, but we do know where they're located. The next time you're at the fort, see if you can find them. And was the Fort McClary parking lot road, which is 100 yards in this direction, the original entrance? No, it was right here. The road traveled diagonally through the woods and came out over here, then up over the hill to here, and then down the hill to over there, where it connected to this lane and eventually out to what is today Purple Road or Route 103. So for those who've walked the path going up the hill to the blockhouse, you were walking on parts of the original road.
Historians and history buffs may not agree on every fact and aspect of this iconic site, but the story of Fort McClary remains fascinating and vivid. It's a story that lives on to this day, a living tribute to our shared past that is still available to us to impact, inspire, and enrich our present lives. Fort McClary, it's accessible, it's beautiful, it's living history. That's something we can all agree on. So take a walk, explore the fort, visit the Blockhouse Museum where Jefferson Davis toured and well-knowns like Vice President Hannibal Hamlin walked and served. Let your imagination take you back in time when Champernoun and Shapley and the Pepperells, William Whipple, and so many of Kittery's ancestry and pioneers looked out over the mighty Piscataqua. Because when we think about what was, we can appreciate what still is. It's a powerful reminder that this site was manned during 5 wars: the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I. And like most other Maine forts, it saw very little conflict. That fact doesn't diminish Fort McClary's significance as an important piece of history that should be recognized as a symbol of our ancestors' commitment to protecting this vital and strategic and beautiful location we call home. This, our Fort McClary, it truly has had many lives.